Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have another Oathbreaker deck tech for you. This is our third one, and it's actually going to be the first one with a gameplay video in the video itself. I'm not going to send you to watch a stream this time. But if you haven't seen this before, it's very similar to our Commander's Guild series, where we are randomly selecting a card from Scryfall.com or having a suggested card, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a deck around a theme of the chosen card. Now, before we get in, I do want to very quickly kind of ask a question to you guys. So normally, for the Commander's Guild, we do a $100 budget limit, but Oathbreaker being 60 cards and having a $100 budget limit means that we get to play a little bit more high power cards, a little bit more expensive cards. And so my question to you guys is, keeping Oathbreakers the way that they are, would you prefer to see a $100 deck or a $60 deck because we have 60 cards? So as we're going through, I'll kind of bring that up again later, but I wanted to ask that question up front, see what you guys thought, and see if you have any opinions for the future. But with that out of the way, before we actually jump into the deck itself, I do want to, as always, highlight some of our social media accounts. So if you are interested in keeping up to date on any videos we put out, if you're interested in making sure that you're able to keep up with everything that's going on with the channel, or even if you just have suggestions and you've got cards that you want to see turned into Commander decks, or you want to see them turned into Oathbreaker decks, or even if you have suggestions for other formats, please do let me know. I would be happy to kind of explore some options there, and I do love making the suggested videos because those are some of the more fun ones, getting to play with people's favorite cards. So you can find us on Twitter, Reddit, email, send us anything you're looking for, and I'll do my best. But all of that out of the way, let's take a quick look at our deck. So this week, we have a random card suggested by Neil Arnold on YouTube, so thank you for the suggestion. And the suggested card is actually the Oathbreaker themselves, and that is Garruk Apex Predator. So 5 black-green for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker, Garruk. +1, destroy another target Planeswalker, very useful in Oathbreaker. +1, put a 3/3 black beast creature token with death touch onto the battlefield. -3, destroy target creature, you gain life equal to its toughness. And -8, target opponent gets an emblem with whenever a creature attacks you, it gets +5/+5 and gains trample until end of turn. So a very, very powerful commander, particularly, as I mentioned, since it's an Oathbreaker, our opponents are going to be having Planeswalkers in their command zone as well, so that +1 to destroy a Planeswalker is going to be incredibly relevant as we're playing through this deck. So you can probably already guess that Garruk is our Oathbreaker, but we do have to give him a signature spell as well. And so this week we are pairing him up with Casualties of War, which is 2 black, green for a sorcery. It says choose 1 or more, destroy target artifact, destroy target creature, destroy target enchantment, destroy target land, and destroy target Planeswalker. So we have 2 massive spells in the command zone, and I think what we'll probably have to do is take a look at some themes and figure out how exactly we're going to actually get to those massive spells in our command zone. So the first theme that's going to help us get there is ramp. We need to put as many lands into play as possible. So honestly, we are running a ton of ramp in this deck. Almost every possible slot that could be ramp is. And of course, we have representing that rampant growth, which is 1 and a green. Sorcery, search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So a very classic ramp spell does exactly what we want. Turn 2 gets us another land, puts us to 4 mana on turn 3, exactly where we want to be with this deck. Now, our next theme is, since we are ramping so much, we're playing so many lands, we need something to do with those lands. So we have cards that care about lands coming in, or in general just benefit from us having lands. So for example, Evolution Sage, 2 and a green for a 3/2 elf druid that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, proliferate. So that means we can choose any number of permanents and or players and give them another counter of a kind they already have. That does include Garruk, so we can just kind of tick up our Planeswalker just by playing lands. So if we can play 3 to 4 lands in a turn, maybe get him within ultimate range and just really do stuff that we shouldn't be able to do much, much quicker than, we should be able to do. And then finally, our last theme for the deck is turning our lands into creatures. We want to play as many lands as we can, and then use those lands to actually kill our opponents. So, for example, we have a Hunting Wilds, which is 3 and a green for a sorcery. It has Kicker for 3 and a green as well. And search your library for up to 2 forest cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. If this spell was kicked, untap all forests put onto the battlefield this way, and they become 3/3 green creatures with haste that are still lands. So we can, it's very expensive, but for 8 mana, get 2 hasty 3/3 creature lands that can hopefully just smack our opponents for 6, or just kind of chip in at maybe their Oathbreakers and kind of get in some damage that we need here and there. And of course, there are other ways to turn our creatures into lands as well, but Hunting Wilds is a good example of exactly what we're trying to do. It's ramp if we need it, and late game, it could hopefully start to kill our opponents. Because the important part about those lands becoming creatures is that it's permanent. It's not until end of turn. They just stay 3/3 creatures, so we can use them to kind of keep chipping in damage here and there. But those are the themes for our deck. And before we move on to the budget and everything else, I do want to take a look at some key cards in this deck, some cards that really help us run and help us hopefully move a little bit closer to victory. Now, the first of those is Nissa Vital Force, which is one of the main card draw engines for this deck. This is 3 green for a Planeswalker, Nissa. She comes in at 5 loyalty, +1 untap target land you control, and until your next turn, it becomes a 5/5 elemental creature with haste, still a land. So incredibly useful. We just make a 5/5 that can protect Nissa, or just get in for a ton of damage. It's got -3, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. Very good. And the main reason we want this card, -6, you get an emblem with whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. So that is our major card draw engine. And if you'll notice, she comes in at 5 and ultimates at 6. So all we have to do is protect her for 1 turn or have an Evolution Sage, and we're able to just get her to ultimate immediately. So a very powerful card draw engine for this deck. When we're playing 3, 4, 5 lands a turn, we get to just keep refilling our hand and keep going with the deck. Our second key card, the Great Aurora, 6 green for a sorcery. Each player shuffles all cards from their hand and all permanents they own into their library, then draws that many cards. Each player may put any number of land cards from their hand onto the battlefield. Exile the Great Aurora. So if we have 15 lands in play and a bunch of ramp spells into our graveyard and, maybe some tokens or planeswalkers on the board, we're able to cast the Great Aurora. Everybody picks everything up. Hopefully at this point we have ramped well above what our opponents have ramped into, so we should have more permanents than them. And then we draw that many cards. We run a ton of lands, so we'll draw into some lands. And then we put all of our lands into play. Now, an important part of this is, 1, the lands don't come in tapped, which means we can float some mana if we have extra, cast the Great Aurora, and then still keep casting things after. Or maybe we just get really lucky, we get a ton of lands, and our opponents don't get much. If we can cast this pretty early, we can really kind of mess with our opponents and make it so that they don't have a ton of permanents or even just lands in general. And then, finally, our last key card is Sylvan Awakening, which is 2 and a green for a sorcery. Until your next turn, all lands you control become 2/2 elemental creatures with reach, indestructible, and haste. They are still lands. So if we have 15 lands in play, we cast Sylvan Awakening. Yeah, we've got to tap 3 of our lands to cast it. But the other 12 lands on the board become 2/2 creatures with reach, indestructible, and haste, which means we can just hit our opponents for 24 damage right there out of nowhere. And this can be incredibly devastating if our opponents aren't expecting it, if they don't have a ton of blockers, or if we've ramped and have most of our lands in play, which is honestly not that big of an issue for this deck. We can get a ton of lands into play very, very quickly. So Sylvan Awakening is a phenomenal win condition for this deck. But those are our key cards. Something else that we're going to do really quickly before we get into the budget is take a look at some cool interactions in this deck, some cards that just work super well together. And the first two are Altar of the Brood and Nissa Who Shakes the World. So Altar of the Brood is a single mana for an artifact that says whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent puts the top card of his or her library into their graveyard. Now, normally, that can be 1 or 2 cards a turn. You're playing a land, casting a spell, putting a creature on board. But with this deck, especially with something like Nissa, we're able to put a ton of permanents into play all at once. So, for example, Nissa Who Shakes the World, 3 green for a legendary planeswalker, Nissa, 5 loyalty. Whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional green, already super powerful for this deck. +1, put 3 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target non-creature land you control. Untap it, it becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with vigilance and haste that's still a land, so helps protect itself, gives it vigilance, we can use the land later. Phenomenal ability. And then, the reason that this really combos with Altar of the Brood is -8. You get an emblem with lands you control have indestructible. Search your library for any number of forest cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. We are running a ton of lands in our land-heavy deck. So this could get maybe 20 forests into play all at once, and all of a sudden our opponents are milling 20 cards each, which in a 60-card format is a third of their deck. It becomes incredibly difficult for our opponents to function after that, especially when we're still hitting our normal land drops and still casting our normal spells. It's just devastating for our opponents to try to deal with that if that's something that happens. Now, our next cool interaction also, believe it or not, still involves a Nissa Planeswalker. I know we've talked about 3 of them. There's only 3 in the deck, I promise. But this one is between Nissa's Triumph, and the reason we're running this is because we have 3 Nissas in the deck. But Nissa's Triumph is green for a sorcery. Search your library for up to 2 basic forest cards, but if you control a Nissa Planeswalker, instead search your library for up to 3 land cards, reveal those cards, put them into your hand, then shuffle your library. Now, you'll notice, if we have a Nissa Planeswalker, that doesn't say search your library for 3 basic land cards. That is 3 lands, period. We could get any land out of our deck. We can get a bounce land, we can get dual lands, we can get utility lands, anything that we need, we can get with Nissa's Triumph as long as we have a Nissa Planeswalker. So, of course, we want to pair that with a Nissa, and so I figured let's take a look at our final Nissa, which is Nissa Worldwaker, 3 green for a Planeswalker, Nissa, 3 loyalty. +1, target land you control becomes a 4/4 elemental creature with trample. It's still a land. And notice, that's not until end of turn. That's permanent, so again, awesome for what we're trying to do. +1, untap up to 4 target forests, so we can ramp. Also very good. And then finally, -7, search your library for any number of basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Those lands become 4/4 elemental creatures with trample, and they are still lands. So if we are ever able to ultimate Nissa Worldwaker, that is just game-ending. That runs over our opponents. We get as many possible lands as possible. We're looking at, 20 basic lands that are all 4/4s. We're smacking our opponents for 80 damage. It is incredibly powerful stuff. So that's a win condition on its own, but pair that with Nissa's Triumph and we can just kind of get whatever lands we want. So definitely a fun interaction for this deck. It'd be nice to pull it off. We do have 3 Nissa Planeswalkers, so it's not impossible to do. But that is the deck itself. The final thing that we've got to do is, of course, take a look at the budget. And the budget for this deck was $89.94, with the most expensive card being our commander, Garruk, Apex Predator. But I mentioned to you guys earlier that I'm not quite sure if I want to keep doing the $100 budget for this deck or if I want to do the $60 budget, because we only have 60 cards, and that allows us to play much more expensive cards and much more powerful cards than we normally do for, say, the Commander's Guild series. And to highlight that, I want to pull up our second most expensive card in the deck, which is actually just Overgrown Tomb. Now, this is a land. This is a shock land that's almost $12. There is no way in our Commander's Guild series that we would be able to play a shock land in our decks because our budget just doesn't allow for it in a 100 card format with $100. So if we were to cut this shock land out of the deck, we're looking at a deck that's under $80 in price, which is very cheap. It's phenomenal. But if our goal was $60, we would still not be under budget. So I still pose the same question to you guys. Would you prefer to keep the Oathbreaker series at $100 so we can play with more powerful cards like this? Or would you rather see the price come down to $60, maybe even $50, depending on your price point, and kind of actually work with some more budget options? Because honestly, it didn't really feel like a budget restriction trying to build a 60-card deck on a $100 budget, because we really didn't even come close. Normally I have to cut some cards at the end, and for this one I just didn't have to. I was able to play every single card that I wanted to play. So it has its pros and cons, but like I said, I want to hear what you guys think if you have a suggestion for future price points for the Oathbreaker videos, because I would like to keep doing Oathbreaker videos. I love the format. I think it's tons of fun. So let me know what you think. Otherwise, though, I promised you guys a gameplay video, so we do have to get to that, which means that we have to talk a little bit about our opponents for this week. Now, our opponents are all actually also playing Golgari decks. So this is a 4-player pod, all of us playing black and green, and we have Shawn playing Grist the Hungertide, which is an insect that is also a planeswalker, that is also a creature, so it's super unique in that way. And he mentioned that this is an insect tribal deck. And then his signature spell in the command zone is Forever Young, so he's able to put any number of creatures from his graveyard on top of his library. He can kind of reanimate his insects and kind of keep the train going. And then after that we have Jason, who is playing Vraska Swarm's Eminence, and this is a Death Touch tribal deck because Vraska wants Death Touch creatures to be doing damage, putting counters on them. She makes assassins that can kill planeswalkers, which is very good in Oathbreaker as well. And then because Jason is putting so many counters on his stuff, his signature spell is Inspiring Call, which draws a card for each creature with a +1/+1 counter on it and gives them indestructible, so he can survive board wipes and combat. So I will admit to being very afraid of that one, because I have seen tiny Death Touch creatures take down massive creatures, and our lands usually aren't indestructible. And then finally, we have Bilal playing Tyvar Kell, which is his elf deck, so gives his elves the ability to tap for black mana, makes elf tokens, and then possibly can also draw cards if he's ever able to ultimate it. And then Bilal, of course, great minds think alike, also has Casualties of War as his signature spell. So I would imagine that elves can make a ton of mana, so I am pretty terrified of elves being able to cast Casualties of War multiple times in a turn. So that's something to watch out for. Our goal is, ramp and just do it first, and then they can't cast it because they won't have any mana. So these are our opponents for the week. Hopefully it goes well. I hope you guys do enjoy the game. Since this is the first Oathbreaker game that's officially on the channel, please do let me know what you think if you'd like to see more of this. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy it, and I will talk to you guys after the game. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Shawn, Jason, and Bilal. I play a Llanowar Wastes. Shawn plays a Temple of Malady, scrying 1. Jason plays a Forest. Bilal plays a Path of Ancestry. I play a Forest and then cast Sakura Tribe Elder. Shawn plays a Forest and then casts Arcane Signet, quickly followed by Caustic Caterpillar, which can be sacrificed to destroy an artifact or enchantment. Jason plays a Swamp. Bilal plays a forest and casts Paradise Druid, and then at the end of his turn I sacrifice Sakura Tribe Elder to put a swamp into play. On my turn I play a forest, and then cast Cultivate, putting a land into play tapped and another into my hand. Shawn casts a Scute Swarm, which makes a 1/1 insect token whenever he plays a land, or creates a copy of itself if he has 6 or more lands. He then plays a tapped Overgrown Tomb, triggering the Scute Swarm and making an insect token. At the end of turn, Jason casts an Ambush Viper. Then on his turn, he floats a green mana, playing Golgari Rot Farm and returning the forest to hand, and then casts Narnam Renegade, which enters with a +1/+1 counter on it since he had a permanent leave the battlefield this turn, and finally he casts Viridian Longbow and passes. Bilal plays a forest and casts Llanowar Tribe. I cast and kick a Grow from the Ashes to put 2 basic lands into play untapped, and then I play a swamp on top of that, before casting a Fertile Footsteps, putting yet another basic land into play and sending Beanstalk Giant on an adventure. Shawn plays a Tainted Wood, making another insect token, and then casts Realm Walker, naming insect and allowing him to look at the top card of his library and cast it if it is an insect. Jason plays a forest, and then moves to combat, attacking me for 4. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Oathbreaker Adversary. Bilal plays a swamp, and casts Guardian Project, which lets him draw a card whenever he casts a creature, and then he casts Llanowar Elves, drawing a card. I play a forest, and then cast my Oathbreaker, Garruk Apex Predator. I immediately activate Garruk's +1 ability to create a 3/3 beast with Death Touch. I then cast a Deep Reconnaissance, putting a basic land into play, and as I go to pass my turn, Shawn casts Plumb the Forbidden, sacrificing 2 insects to copy it twice, letting him draw a total of 3 cards and lose 3 life. On Shawn's turn, he plays a swamp, making an insect token, and then casts Nantuko Elder from the top of his library, and a morph creature from his hand. Jason plays a swamp, and moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 2 with Oathbreaker Adversary, drawing a card when it deals combat damage. And then, in his second main phase, he casts Golden Demise, giving all creatures -2/-2 until end of turn, wiping away most of the board. On Bilal's turn, he plays a forest, and then casts Harmonize, drawing 3 cards, followed up by casting Azuri Renegade Leader, which can regenerate his elves and give them all +3/+3 and trample until end of turn when activated. He also draws a card from the Guardian Project and passes. I play a forest and activate Garruk's +1 ability to create another beast, and then cast Beanstalk Giant, which has power and toughness equal to the number of lands I control, currently being a 12/12. After that, I cast an Hour of Promise, putting 2 lands into play tapped, which wind up being a Westvale Abbey and a Blighted Woodland. Shawn casts Sir Conrad the Grim, which does 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature goes into a graveyard from anywhere, or whenever a creature leaves Shawn's graveyard. Jason plays a forest, and then casts his Oathbreaker, Vraska Swarm's Eminence. He then moves to combat and attacks Shawn and Bilal for 2 each, drawing a card when the adversary does damage, and putting a +1/+1 counter on each creature that dealt the damage. In his second main phase, he activates Vraska's -2 ability to create a 1/1 assassin token with Death Touch. Bilal plays a Blighted Woodland, and then casts his Oathbreaker, Tyvar Kell. he immediately activates Tyvar's +1 ability to put a +1/+1 counter on Llanowar Tribe and untap it. This allows him to cast Elvish Clan Caller, giving all his elves +1/+1 and drawing a card. He also casts Elvish Guidance on a forest, letting it tap for green mana equal to the number of elves in play. And finally, he casts Beast Whisperer, which lets him draw a card whenever he casts a creature, and he also draws from Guardian Project. On my turn, I activate Garruk's +1 ability, making another beast token. And then I cast my signature spell, Casualties of War. This allows me to destroy Viridian Longbow, Izuri, Renegade Leader, Elvish Guidance, Tyvar Kell, and Shawn's Overgrown Tomb. I then pass to Shawn. On Shawn's turn, he casts Ant Queen from the top of his library, which can be activated to create a 1/1 insect token. On Jason's turn, he plays a forest and casts Finn the Fangbearer, which gives his opponents 2 poison counters whenever his Death Touch creatures do combat damage to them, and he moves to combat attacking Garruk with an Assassin, Bilal for 3, and Shawn for 3. Before the damage, I cast Death Sprout to destroy the Assassin and put a basic land into play. Then Shawn and Bilal each take 3 and get 2 poison counters, while Jason puts a +1/+1 counter on his creatures and draws a card. In Jason's second main phase, he activates Vraska to create another Assassin token, and then casts Isareth the Awakener. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Swamp and passes. I play an Overgrown Tomb tapped, and then I ultimate Garruk, giving Shawn an emblem that says any creature that attacks him gets +5/+5 and trample until end of turn, and at this point, Shawn decides to concede rather than die to the emblem. Once that's done, I decide to recast Garruk, Apex Predator, and activate the new Garruk's +1 ability to make another beast token. On Jason's turn, he plays a forest, and then attacks me with everything except Finn, activating Isareth when she attacks to return Ambush Viper to play from his graveyard. In response, Bilal sacrifices his Blighted Woodland to put 2 basic lands into play, just to save a little bit of time. I then block all 4 of Jason's creatures with my 4 beasts, killing everything that was in combat. Then in Jason's second main phase, he casts a Vampire Nighthawk, followed by a Wasteland Viper. At the end of turn, Bilal casts Return of the Wild Speaker to draw 4 cards, and in response, I sacrifice my Blighted Woodland to put 2 basic lands into play, once again, saving some time. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Command Tower and recasts his Oathbreaker Tyvar Kell. He then casts an Arbor Elf, drawing 2 cards, and activates Tyvar's +1 ability to put a +1/+1 counter on Llanowar Tribe and untap it. He then decides to cast Sign in Blood to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. And finally, he casts an Elvish Champion, giving all elves +1/+1 and Forest Walk and drawing 2 cards. This allows him to go to combat and attack me for 13 unblockable damage, putting me down to just 1 life. On my turn, I activate Garruk's other +1 ability, destroying Tyvar Kell, and then I cast Nissa Who Shakes the World, letting all my forests tap for 2 mana. This allows me to cast Casualties of War to destroy Elvish Champion, Guardian Project, Vraska, and Jason's Golgari Rot Farm. And then, thanks to Nissa, I'm able to recast Casualties of War, destroying one of Jason's swamps, Bilal's Arbor Elf, in the hopes that will incentivize Jason to attack Bilal and not me. Finally, I cast Farseek failing to find since all my swamps are already in play. I then activate Nissa's +1 ability to untap a land and put 3 +1/+1 counters on it, turning it into a creature. On Jason's turn, he attacks Bilal with everything he's got, knocking him out of the game by giving him 10 poison counters. Jason also gains 2 life from the Vampire Nighthawk, and then in his second main phase he recasts Vraska, activating her -2 ability to create an assassin token. On my turn, I simply activate Garruk's -3 ability to destroy Jason's assassin token and gain a life, activate Nissa's +1 ability to turn another land into a creature, and then I attack Jason for 23 damage, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a pretty sweet game, pretty quick. Honestly, I kind of forgot how fast Oathbreaker games can be. That's a big reason I'm a fan of the format. You don't have to commit to an hour-long game every time you sit down. But the deck itself, I think, performed very well. We ramped like crazy in the beginning. There were multiple times when I think we flew under the radar because we weren't doing anything other than ramping, but eventually once we got Garruk on board and kind of built up an army of beasts, everyone kind of started to look our way but couldn't do much about it. And because Jason's Death Touch creatures were kind of keeping Shawn in check and they were keeping Bilal in check, we just started to run away with the game. It was unfortunate, I think, that Shawn conceded when he did, because I had no intention of attacking him on that turn. I was hoping to kind of get Jason to do the dirty work, and then I could take Jason out, but didn't quite work out the way that I wanted it to. I do think it was pretty sweet that we got to ultimate Garruk, though. I never thought we'd ultimate Garruk. He's pretty high loyalty to be ultimating, but everyone's deck did, I think, exactly what they tried to do. I wish that we'd been able to see a little bit more of Jason, Shawn, and Bilal's decks, because they kind of got stuck at a few points. Bilal very much did what he wanted to do, but he admitted himself he didn't draw a ton of elves. Shawn didn't really draw too many insects, and then Jason played some pretty sweet Death Touchers, but I think that the Finn the Fangbearer was the MVP for his side of the board, being able to infect Bilal out of the game like that. So all in all, it was a ton of fun. Definitely looking forward to more Oathbreaker content in the future. So if you liked it, please do like the video so that way I know people are interested, and I'm more than happy to keep making this kind of stuff. And if you have suggestions for cards that you would like to see turned into Oathbreaker decks, please do let me know. You don't have to suggest an Oathbreaker or a signature spell. You can just suggest a card to go in the deck. But let me know. And other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.